We've all been there, in just a few days until our well-deserved holidays, where we're trying to pack our luggage as densely as possible inside our bags. In scientific terms, we're essentially trying to solve a so-called packing problem, one of many that we all encounter in our daily lives. You could say, packing and stacking, we lay waste our days. In a series of small lectures, I want to introduce you now to the slightly simpler problem of packing spheres densely inside a cylinder. I investigated this problem during my time as a PhD student at Trinity College Dublin, and together with Hoki Chan, an associate professor in physics from China, I published now a book about these packing problems and its solutions. You'll find a link to our book in the description below. The solutions are so-called ordered columnar structures, and examples of such structures are actually displayed in our book cover in the picture right here. During this YouTube video, I want to show you now first how you can assemble such structures at home yourself in an easy experiment, and also why they are interesting to the scientific community, and at the end explain you some of our most important findings from my PhD thesis. And maybe by the end of it, you've learned a thing or two on how you can pack your holiday luggage more efficiently. So this here is a simple experiment on how you can create columnar structures yourself at home, for which you only need some golf balls and a cylindrical tube. By sequentially dropping golf balls inside a tube, the golf balls automatically assemble to this nicely ordered structure. This is already an example of a so-called columnar structure. And at the end of the GIF, I added these overlaid lines to the golf ball packing. These lines represent the contacts between the golf balls, and we will see later that they help us to identify the actual structure type. There's a decent interest in these structures within the scientific community due to their diverse appearance on many length scales. The probably largest natural columnar structures can be found in the corpse flowers, which can be up to a meter in size. So initially, such structures were studied in botany. The berries or seeds of various plants assemble in such a fashion around the stem. I took this picture of a cocoa plant myself in Dublin, which just shows you Dublin was the perfect place to study such structures. Now, during my time in Dublin, I was doing a PhD in the Foams and Complex Systems group. The group's interest into such structures stems from the fact that bubbles can actually crystallize inside tubes to columnar structures. These are then on the centimeter scale, but you can also go way lower in length scale. In this example here, scientists from Penn State University generated micro rods by letting silicon particles self-assemble inside cylindrical PDMS pores. They can then be used to fabricate novel material such as liquid crystals. On a similar length scale, a group in Harvard actually tried to build so-called optical metamaterials with these structures. So this is a material with a negative refractive index, and it finds application in superlenses. They created such structures by self-assembling nanocolloids on the surface of a cylinder. And then, on the nanometer scale, Brazilian scientists actually managed to alter the physical and chemical properties of nanotubes using such structures. They are here assembled by trapping spherical molecules such as fullerenes inside the nanotubes. Now, while all these examples occur in different length scales and in different contexts, they all have one thing in common. They are ordered structures. Not only do I think, me as a German, am therefore designated to study those structures, but also does this similarity allow us to model all these different experiments with just one generic simulation model. And one very obvious parameter that influences the type of generated packing is the diameter ratio of sphere to cylinder. For small diameter ratios, you can get this simple zigzag structure, but with increasing diameter ratio, these structures become more and more complex. Some of them can be chiral, like the 3-2-1, and others are achiral, like the 3-3-0. We use this phototactic notation here, such as 2-2-0, 3-2-1, 3-3-0, and so on, to just categorize the different types of structures. It's a notation adopted from botany, where it is used to classify the arrangement of leaves, and each number essentially describes the number of spiral it takes in which you can decompose the structure with respect to the crystallographic direction. You'll find a detailed explanation of this notation in our book, and its main purpose in our research and for this video was simply to have a unique label for each structure. So these examples here all display so-called uniform structure. They all share a certain symmetry. And we'll come back later to the explanation of such structures and other structures that we found in our research. But let's first focus on the different simulation models that you can actually use to generate such packings. In the past, simulations were performed for so-called hard sphere packings. So these are essentially spheres that are always a minimum distance of the diameter d apart. So essentially it means spheres cannot overlap or deform. A crucial physical metric of hard sphere packings is the so-called packing fraction or packing density. And in the case of columnar structures, it is given by the ratio of total sphere volume to cylinder volume. So the packing fraction actually measures how efficiently objects are packed inside a given space. And Mughal et al. Investigated the optimal packing fraction for hard sphere structures depending on the diameter ratio between spheres and cylinder. He discovered actually that these uniform structures that I showed you earlier occur at the peaks of this curve, and the structures between them are so-called line slip structures, which will play a major role during this presentation at a later point. Now, the hard sphere model, however, only has limited application in real life. Most objects in nature, like bubbles or seeds around a stem, are like squishy and deformable. So we use a well-established model from the foam research of so-called soft spheres. In this model, the spheres can overlap, but when they overlap, they behave like repelling springs, and their energy goes up with the overlap squared. Now, to investigate soft sphere packings inside a cylinder, we put those soft spheres of diameter d into a tubular unit cell with a certain length L and a diameter d. Our intention here is to simulate an infinite column, so we employ so-called image spheres to simulate periodic boundaries with a certain twist angle. And we're interested in generating structures at a certain uniaxial pressure P. Then what we do is we calculate the enthalpy, which consists of the internal energy of the system plus a pressure times volume term. And we generate these structures then by simply minimizing the enthalpy of the system. We can do this in two ways. The first one is we can look for local minimization. So here methods like gradient descent or conjugate gradient are used. This is mainly interesting for simulating like quasi-static simulations and studying like structural transitions. We are, however, more interested in using global minimization techniques, such as simulated annealing or Bayesian hopping. And we do this to map out a phase diagram of stable structures. So a phase diagram is usually used in thermodynamics to display the conditions at which different phases occur. So despite dealing with an athermal system here, we can still borrow terms like phase diagram from thermodynamics for our purposes. In our case, the phases are the different possible structures that assemble under different conditions. So each region in this diagram corresponds to a particular structure. The conditions that we vary in our simulations were then the diameter ratio and the uniaxial pressure. Notice here that there is no overlap between spheres at zero pressure. Thus, the P equals 0 line resembles essentially the hard sphere limit, where we were actually able to reproduce the sequence of the 10 uniform and the 14 line slip structure that Mughal et al. Found already before us. In the soft sphere region, we unfortunately did not discover any new surprising structures, but we did observe the vanishing of the line slip with increasing pressure. So however, the soft sphere region starts already above P greater than 0. This phase diagram does in general predict the existence of line slip structures for soft sphere systems, which has never been realized experimentally so far. But before we explore the experimental side of such structures, I owe you the explanation of what a line slip structure and what a uniform structure is and how they differ. So first of all, what is a uniform structure? So on the left-hand side, you see here an example of a uniform structure. In the middle, you see its contact network. So here, each dot represents a sphere and each line represents a contact between the spheres. What we notice here is that each sphere essentially has 6 contacts in this uniform structure. So essentially, the neighborhood of each sphere looks identical. When we then roll out this contact network into a plane, we get this perfect hexagonal pattern. So what is now a line slip structure and how does it differ to a uniform structure? So on the left-hand side, I present you again an example of a line slip structure. To the untrained eye, you probably can't see anything special here yet. But if you then look into the contact network in the center, each dot here represents a sphere again and each line a contact. You'll notice that some neighboring spheres actually have this gap or loss of contact. If you then roll out this pattern again onto a plane, it reveals that these spheres actually slipped along a line, hence the name line slip structure. And these structures are actually very special. The gap or line slip extent can be adjusted with the pressure or compression of the system. So this actually has great potential for applications in material science. So the compression is actually a control parameter of physical quantities like the stiffness, conductivity, or even the resonance frequency of the structure. So if you think about this structure as an electromagnetic resonator, then the resonance frequency can actually be tuned by the compression of our structure. And now that you've been taught the characteristics of a line slip, let's get back to our prediction. So our phase diagram predicted the existence of such structures for soft sphere system close to the hard sphere limit. So we went to the lab and put this to the test. We managed to create a line slip structure using bubbles inside a tube. And all you need to do for this is you fill up a tube with bubbles and then you add liquid from the top to get close to the hard sphere limit. And at some point we noticed that actually gaps were opening up between the bubbles. And now by comparing the experimental image with the simulation image, the structure can indeed be identified as a line slip structure. And to my knowledge, we were the first to ever experimentally realize a line slip structure with soft matter system. However, the phase diagram does not display the full picture about self-assembling of such structures. It only provides us the parameters under which the ground states assemble, but it completely neglects metastability. And if you think now about how you'd go about assembling such structures in an experiment, it is very unlikely that you will immediately generate ground state structures. A real-life experiment will more look like this. You'll start in a possibly metastable structure, such as the 3-to-1 that I present here on this slide, and then you vary one of the parameters until a structural change occurs. So for instance, when you increase the diameter ratio of the 3-to-1, it will eventually transform into the 4-to-2. Now, decreasing the diameter ratio will get you back into the 3-to-1. However, the point of transition might differ upon increasing or decreasing the parameter. So this phenomena is known as hysteresis, which simply means the transition depends on the structural history. We observe now that hysteresis only exists above a certain pressure point. So there's no hysteresis for hard spheres, only above a certain level of softness. And this structural transition here is a reversible transition. So you might wonder if also a irreversible transition exists. And the answer to this is yes. So if you increase the diameter ratio of the 4-to-1, it eventually turns into the 5-3-2. But if you decrease the diameter ratio from here, it will actually favor the 4-3-1 structure. Now, continuously decreasing the diameter ratio from here will eventually get you back into the 3-to-1 structure. So structures can actually be transformed in this cyclic pattern that you can only cycle through clockwise matter. So this cyclic pattern is actually something that we observe not only for these structures, but also for a range of other structures that we all describe in our book. Now, if you're interested in understanding the full picture of such structural transitions, I recommend you to read our book. And in my next video, I will present you how the topic of columnar structures was given a new spin by the group from South Korea. They come up with a novel method to create columnar structures experimentally that actually involve rapid rotations.